Hello to all you students of microbiology, clinical microbiology, all pre-nursing, pre-dental, pre-medical, pre-graduate school, anyone who is generally interested in clinical or infectious microbiology, or is planning to pursue a career in the clinical aspects. This is another one of my videos that I'm recording. This is primarily an introductory level course in clinical microbiology, just trying to explain the basics of infectious microbiology and hopefully presenting the material in such a way that you can understand, grasp it easily, because many students develop a fear of clinical microbiology, and really it does not have to be that way. It depends on how the material is presented to you so that you can easily understand it, because a lot of it is really very applicable in daily life, even if you're not going to pursue a career in clinical microbiology or medicine or allied health. So in the continuing series of videos I've recorded, this one is going to discuss how infections start. In other words, where do those microbes come from that infect us and cause disease? Because we do need to understand the journey of where those organisms come from, if you want to call it their natural residence, and how they get from there to our bodies, where we, the hosts, end up suffering the consequences of them entering our body, the consequences of them infecting our body. It's that journey. We need to be able to understand that journey so that we can interrupt it and prevent them from causing the disease that they do cause in us. So the next slide, slide number 2, is going to cover where these microbes start. And I'm introducing the term reservoir. Now, you may have heard of this term in connection with, say, a reservoir, of a water reservoir. For example, if a county has a very big tank, you have seen those side of the road, and this is the major source of this is the water supply for the county. We call it a water reservoir. Well, it's kind of like the same kind of with microbes. There are different areas where these organisms naturally call home, they naturally reside. But if they end up leaving their natural reservoir, their natural source, and enter our body, then they become pathogenic and they cause all kinds of problems. I'm going to discuss 3 major reservoirs. The first one is what I call the human reservoir. And there's some people, even though they're not showing any symptoms, they may actually be carrying a pathogen. You have heard a little of that with some people who have COVID, but they're not showing any symptoms at all. We call those carriers. It could be due to the fact that maybe they have a much stronger immunity. It could be that they are not as susceptible to various infections as opposed to someone else who's immunocompromised, but then we'll call them carriers. However, if the pathogen jumps from those people to someone else who's more susceptible, then the result could be an infection. A second type of reservoir is animal reservoirs, and this is usually the source of what we call zoonoses, which are defined as diseases transmitted from animals to humans. The third type of source of microbes is non-living reservoirs, and some of these could be soil, it could be water, or even air, which is one of the reasons why we're going around wearing masks, because if you come close to someone who has a microbe that is in the air, they're breathing it out, and you're in that general air environment close enough to them, then you could pick up that particular pathogen by being sharing the same airspace as that person, which is why we're practicing social distancing. We move on to slide number 3, and this is where I give examples over each of those 3 types of reservoirs for microbes. So the first example of human reservoirs is blood and blood products. So blood is a major source of certain viruses like hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV. So particularly if a person is working in close contact with patients, for example, drawing the blood, if you're a phlebotomist, when you draw the blood from that patient, if you stick yourself, there's a potential of some of that blood in the needle having the particular pathogen, a virus or a bacteria in some cases, that could potentially enter your body and cause an infection in you. Other human reservoirs could be the respiratory tract. Again, if you breathe in certain other pathogens, the flu virus, COVID, that is why we're wearing masks again, and we're practicing social distancing to reduce the exposure to those microbes that are reservoirs in the respiratory tract of some other people. The reproductive system, there's some other pathogens that could be in someone's reproductive system, and certain bacteria, like especially the sexually transmitted organisms like gonorrhea and HIV, and of course syphilis. Well, they are living in one human being, and they could be passed on to another human being through sexual activity, which is why it's strongly recommended that people practice safe sex using devices like condoms to reduce the risk of exposure from human reservoirs. Slide 4 gives examples of animal reservoirs. And here I give a few examples of zoonosis, or diseases that can be caused by pathogens coming from other animals. The pig is a major one. That is where pathogens like the swine flu virus can live normally in the pig, but if it jumps from the pig, from pork to humans, then it can cause problems. Avian flu virus, it lives primarily in birds and other fowl that we can eat, we potentially use as food sources. Turkeys and chickens could be source of various viruses. Slide 5 gives other examples: raccoons, skunks, foxes, some wild dogs. They can be the sources of these virus and other bacteria. And if your person gets bitten by one of these, then they could potentially catch rabies from those wild animals. Another source is dogs that have not had their shots, and we call them rabid dogs, and you get bitten by one of those. Some of those microbes that are naturally living in that dog as their natural reservoir would definitely be passed on to you through the bite, which is one of the reasons why they always recommend, if you have been bitten by a dog, make sure you get your rabies shot, just in case that dog had the rabies in it and could pass it on to you. Another big animal reservoir, of course, are wildlife like monkeys, chimpanzees, even bats. That is where you could find other viruses like the Ebola virus. Now, this one, even though these are wild animals, you can think of them as potentially being passed on to humans through development. If there are areas that are being cleared of forest and wild grown area in order to do construction, build new buildings, then those wild animals get replaced. Their living areas are being cleared, and they may end up in closer contact with humans. And any pathogen or virus that normally lives in them, causing no problems, can be passed on to humans, where it could cause some major issues. And I don't need to emphasize enough the problems that can be caused by Ebola virus infections. Other people may live in neighborhoods where they have some wild areas that are overgrown areas where some wild animals are living. For example, deer. In some subdivisions, there are deer living in the bushes behind some of those homes. And if some of those deer carry a specific pathogen, it could potentially be passed on to humans. If you decide you want to go pet the deer, if they allow you to pet them, you could potentially pick up those pathogens that normally live in the wildlife but end up causing problems in you, the human being. Slide 7. Slide 6 covers non-living reservoirs. And here I'm talking about reservoirs, soil and water and air. Now, some organisms naturally live in soil or in water. The problem comes when they get passed on from those natural environments, natural reservoirs, to the humans. If you're working in your yard, get your soil on your fingers, you're busy enjoying that yard work, but you forget to wash your hands well, then you go inside and try to take out a contact lens, or you don't wash your hands properly before you put in your contact lens. That is one way to pass on whatever microbe is in the soil that it ends up getting in under your fingernails and then getting passed on to your contact lenses. That is how some fungal infections can end up causing eye problems. Keratitis is one of those. Another one, of course, is contaminated water. There are many, many microbes that live naturally in contaminated water, but they could be passed on to humans. Vibrio cholera is one of those. It causes diarrhea. Then you have the guinea worm, again, which lives in water, but can be passed on to humans. Some other water pathogens. If you have a pet that has not had its shots, if they urinate and that urine get in contact with that urine, there are certain other pathogens that can be passed on. They're naturally living in the water, in the urine, but they get passed on to you. Then you end up having problems. And this is why, like in areas where people cannot afford shoes and they walk around barefoot, that makes it very easy for certain microbes that naturally live in water to enter the person's body through the foot, either through broken skin, open wound, or just boring through the foot and entering the human body and causing problems. A lot of worms are picked up that way. They can lead to various big and serious infections like elephantiasis and filariasis. Basically, those worms just burrow their way through the foot and enter the human body and block various systems like the lymphatic system, causing blockage and backup of fluid. You end up with a backed up lymphedema in the leg, sometimes commonly called elephantiasis, because the legs look like an elephant leg because of the fluid that is backed up from the worm that is blocking your system. So for this reason, this slide 7, is summarizing the take-home message, why we have to understand the various sources of these microbes, the various reservoirs, because when we have that knowledge of the potential sources of pathogens, then we know better how to prevent them by interfering with the connection between the sources and us. There are several things we can do. We can avoid getting exposed to blood and other body fluids where microorganisms that are human reservoirs can be picked up from, by practicing a technique called universal precautions. This is a very common practice in the clinical environment, meaning that we universally assume that any body fluid we handle could potentially have a pathogen in it, and as such, we practice precautions, wearing gloves, changing gloves frequently, wearing face shields in some cases to avoid any spillage. Other precautions: complete cooking of food, meats like chicken and pork, to make sure that any pathogens that came from animal reservoirs like pigs and birds are completely killed. Minimizing exposure to wildlife to avoid getting in contact with viruses like Ebola. Avoiding contaminated air and water by using protective tools, methods like wearing masks, which is what we're doing with COVID. Wearing shoes. There's some places that children do not wear shoes, cannot afford shoes, and they end up catching infections from water. Just simply wearing shoes could prevent that.